about today is just really around the technology costs. Where do those costs come from, and how do they compare between the different technologies? At this stage, what I'm presenting is just really the generation costs. We're not talking about demand side or storage, although I would like to talk a little bit about that and what that means in terms of future iterations. So ideally, when we look at technology costs, we want to look at an independent study as to where these costs come from. So originally, when we did IRP 2010, we decided that we did not want to use the ESCOM costs. ESCOM had a collection of costs. We had a project development department that had a series of costs, but we decided we needed to go out and get an independent source. And the source that was chosen at the time was EPRI from North America, and they have quite a decent database of what their members are doing, and they look at what other people in the industry are doing in terms of new generation technology. So they originally produced the report back in 2010, 2009 that we used for the IRP 2010, and have consequently added and updated a lot of their information for us. There are other sources such as Lazar and a couple of others who put together useful information that we can use to check against EPRI. And back in 2010, we also then went out specifically for photovoltaic after the first round of public participation and got Boston Consulting Group to do a study for us on the future for photovoltaic, which actually came back with quite significant changes, which were then incorporated into the later studies. But we also then, now when we look back over the last 5-6 years, we've seen that we've got a procurement process that is working. We're able to get those costs and get information out of that costing process. I have to say one thing about levelized cost versus technology cost. We saw recently, and it's a misnomer that seems to come out quite often in the press and in people speaking on these platforms, that levelized cost is the be-all and end-all of the analysis. Levelized cost is just an indicator. It's just taking into consideration other cost characteristics and turning it into a single number that we can talk about and we can compare things. When we do modeling, we do not model based on levelized cost. Levelized cost is just an indicator. And there's also been this discussion that levelized cost does not equal, or the bid program does not give us levelized cost. Actually, the bid program gives us a pretty good description of levelized cost, because as long as there's a good competitive market environment, that you're having bids, that are enough people participating in the bid process, that bid price that comes out of it actually represents a pretty good indication of what is the total cost that the seller needs to recover over the life of that plant. So we've seen from bid window 4 that those costs that come out of it are, at least for PV and wind, a pretty close approximation of what would be the levelized cost of those plants. For CSP, and I know I'm probably going to get lynched by the concentrating solar people once they get out of this room, for CSP, it's a bit tricky to say that that's really a good, accurate description of levelized costs, because I'm not sure that there's enough competition for those projects for you to actually be able to drive down markups. So if you had a very strong competitive environment like we do for PV and wind, you can be sure that the outcome of bid window 4, expedited, whatever the process that you're operating, would give you a good levelized cost basis. But from that information, we then need to work backwards to be able to determine cost structures in terms of fixed cost, capital, O&M, all those aspects which actually the model requires to be able to produce an output. So what we've done is, when we talk about overnight capital costs, these are some of the critical components that the model will need to look at capital costs. So what I've done is just trying to give a comparison between what was used in 2010, what was used for the IRP 2017, and what EPRI had originally given us. So if we look at the blue, the dark blue, is really the costs as they were in 2010 rands, including the learning. So for PV and wind, we would have assumed that there'd be a reduction in 2017 based on 2010 rands, and then I've adjusted for inflation with a very light blue, which didn't come out that well, but it's a little bit higher than what was there previously in 2010. The important aspects then are the red dots, and that's what we've used in the IRP 2017 in terms of the overnight capital costs. So you can see that for PF coal, FBC coal, and nuclear, those are substantially higher than what we'd assumed in 2010, adjusting for inflation. Some of that is Forex, but obviously foreign exchange is a lot higher now than what it was then. But one of the other aspects is just that, particularly here, if we look at in terms of EPRI, the EPRI result is the markup there. It's interesting that particularly on nuclear, EPRI was very bullish on nuclear back in 2010, and were giving us costs of about $3,000, $3,500 a kilowatt for a new nuclear plant. Now they've turned the other way, and EPRI says, well, to build a new nuclear power station, you're looking at $7,000 a kilowatt. That's quite a big jump. And if we put that into the RAND terms, we're getting close to $100,000 there. But the Department of Energy did its own study, and you've seen that, the Ingerprop study, which suggested that the real cost would be close to $70,000. Similarly, for wind and PV, EPRI also had pretty high costs for wind and PV on a RAND per kilowatt basis, but we've obviously then seen from bid window 4, and then also subsequently from the expedited, those costs have come down quite substantially. And the important part here is that these costs were reverse engineered from the expedited. So the dots here for wind and PV, the wind at 18,800 Rand a kilowatt, and PV at 16,500. Those are then the costs that go into the model. We do a certain amount of adjustment because obviously we have to adjust for the expenditure curve for a program. So if you're building coal over 6 to 7 years, obviously there's interest during construction, so that has to be built into the final price that goes into the model. For renewables, obviously if you only have a 1 or a 2 year lead, then that's a much lower figure. And that then becomes part of the process when we develop. So then, and again, I'm committing the crime that I'm telling everyone else that, to be careful of, is putting it into levelized cost basis, but it sometimes helps for the comparison. So what we've done here is, assuming certain capacity factors, we determine a screening curve from the levelized cost basis. So if we look, for example, just at the nuclear, on that side, if we are operating at about a 90% load factor, then the nuclear cost would be just short of R1.20 kilowatt hour. If we're looking at coal at the same basis, it's cheaper. And here for the coal, we've used the EPRI coal costs, and also assuming, try and get my numbers right again, 580 Rand a ton for coal. So it's quite expensive. So we're making sure that we are accounting for where coal might be going over the next few years. In terms of CCGT, and this is also an interesting one, because particularly for combined cycle gas turbine using gas, I'm assuming quite a large range, because the whole point of combined cycle gas is that you have flexibility. That's why it is so popular in the IRP modeling, because it gives you that flexibility to operate either at a low level, be it at 30%, or at a higher level. And at 30%, yes, the cost will be higher on a levelized cost basis, but that additional cost is more than offset by the flexibility that it's giving you in order to back up the renewable plant. Interestingly enough, a base load gas plant, and here we were looking at costs of 150 Rand gigajoule, if I remember correctly, Jacob. So here at those costs, coal is cheaper, base load coal is cheaper than base load gas. But we would want to build gas because of its flexibility. And here I've also just given a few ranges around wind and PV. Obviously, the better the wind resource and the better the PV resource, the much lower the levelized cost would be. But again, in the model, we look at the capital cost. We don't look at levelized costs, because even on renewables, the capital cost is pretty critical. If you are building a system which has a high penetration of PV and wind, you are likely to have some curtailment. You're going to have points where you just can't actually take the PV and wind output. That curtailment has a cost, a social cost, and there's a real cost for the developer, but for society as well. So we need to, if we're putting in the capital cost and we've got curtailment, you are already dealing with the cost of that curtailment. If you're only doing a levelized cost and you reduce the amount that you're getting from the PV or the wind, then you're actually understating the cost of that system, because you're now not taking into account the cost of curtailment. So these kind of costs are important, and they are there as an indicative idea of where we are in terms of the levelized cost of plant. I just want to compare it a little bit to what's happening internationally, and this is the information coming out of the World Economic Forum on where costs are going in North America. And it's much the same as what we've experienced in terms of renewables. Interestingly enough, for them, obviously gas is pretty cheap because of shale gas, that it is still, but renewable plants are now competing with shale gas in terms of an offering to the market. coal substantially higher, and nuclear climbing there in North America. But just a little bit I want to talk about the storage, and I know it was mentioned, Jacob was talking about it earlier, is that we have to be aware that technology is changing. The same as in 2010, PV was changing so much. When we did the original PV for 2010, the model didn't want it, it was just too expensive. But the moment you incorporated the latest developments and learning, then PV became quite a big player in the market. So now we have to also be paying attention to what's happening around battery. And here we're talking about vehicles. This is from Bloomberg. They were talking about the vehicle battery pack prices coming down from $600 a kilowatt hour storage to $209 over just a 5-year period. At the moment, utility level battery at lithium ion is still in the process of about $300 a kilowatt hour storage. But interestingly enough, when we did the EPRI numbers that we used in the modeling, because we did include storage in the modeling, we're still at about close to $600 a kilowatt hour storage. So it's already halved from what we had assumed when we did the IRP modeling initially. So it's something that we do need to pay attention to and look at where we're going. We've done some initial analysis just looking at, is it possible to include battery? But one of the things to be aware of is that we have huge seasonal variation in terms of PVs particularly. Right now, our PV plants, the IPPs that are operating, can move between 20% in winter to 30% load factor, which is quite a big variation on average. And that means that in winter, we then have a huge energy shortfall, which we would expect either gas or batteries to make up. And you can't build batteries to handle seasonal fluctuation. It's a very fixed kind of issue. Gas, maybe you could by having contracted for additional gas in winter and things like that. So there's some flexibility, at least in the gas market. So we have to be aware of those things to look at. Maybe the solution is to move where the solar plants are to get better winter load factors and to try and offset some of that variation. But those are the studies that we need to be doing more of and looking at. There is potentially a point where batteries might replace gas as our backup capability. That's it from my side. Thanks.